Welcome back. Um, I'm sure you've missed me as I have missed you. Today, after speaking about religion generally and getting into kind of the foundations of religion, which we call the big questions, and moving through this experience of transcendence that people have, this experience of the beyond, what is out there, and how this often codifies into religious practice. Now we're going to talk about one of the most ubiquitous and controversial subjects in religion, and that is, of course, God. Now, this is more important than one might think. So right now, for this lecture, I don't want to really get into the question of does God exist? Okay? I will have a lecture that will be recommended but not required on why I think there is good reason to believe that God does exist. It's not going to be a scientific proof. And you can watch that if you'd like. But for today, I'm more interested in getting at who or what this God being is. It is somewhat strange that there seems to be an assumption among people who talk about religion, talk about a particular religion, talk about issues of suffering and evil or history, and everyone seems to assume that we all mean the same thing by this word, that the word God is just self-explanatory. And in some ways it is. There are definitely things that always obtain when you use this word. We're talking about a being of great power. We're talking about a being of extraordinary knowledge. We're talking about a being that somehow formed the universe that we live in, at least. But there is a lot of disagreement about what is meant by this term. Now, we will be taking in a very particular notion of what God means. It's a notion that has been in the tradition for a long time, and other traditions that we'll talk about in a moment. So when we get what gets the question of God off the ground is this notion of transcendence, right? If there is something beyond, and it's not just our imagination. There's something that gave rise to this, that transcends it. Then somehow or another, this being must be in some regard responsible for it. At least is responsible for its creation or its current order. And so this being, this transcendent being, is what all major religions call God, for the most part, particularly monotheistic religions, although there are polytheistic religions that do have a sort of creator God being who is more powerful than the pantheon of gods, but is not the only God. So the point that we need to get to, though, is that, and this is the whole argument that David Bentley Hart is making, is that if we're going to have this discussion about God, we need to understand what the hell we're talking about. What does this word mean? And of course, there are varying accounts. According to Hart, and I'm in agreement, this isn't just like the atheists or whatever. This isn't just people like Richard Dawkins. Or Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris or Bill Maher or whoever. These people, I would say, do not understand what the majority of the human philosophical and theological tradition says about this God being. But there's also a great number of Christians who don't really understand what the tradition that they even belong to teaches about God. So God is not just a catch-all word. It's a very specific term with very specific parameters. depending on the tradition you come from. So the tradition that we're going to, we'll get to that second. So, for example, we have a number of different theisms. Theism comes from the word theos in Greek, which is the word for God. And it's also the word we get for theology, which is theos and logos. So theology is the study of God, similar to psychology, which is psyche, which is soul in Greek, and then logos, which is word or discipline or study. So that's the study of the mind or the soul. So theism is generally considered to be some sort of belief in a God or gods. Some of these refer to number, as you can see. Polytheism, that there are many gods. There's even ditheism, that there are two gods. Sometimes they're like a married couple, and sometimes they're at odds with each other, say in Zoroastrianism, where evil and good are gods that are continually locked in a sort of yin-yang battle. And this is how the universe maintains balance. And then, of course, there is monotheism, which is the notion that there is only one God who is responsible for all. Others refer to nature. Some argue that God is everything. That's pantheism, from pan meaning all. So everything's God. This lecture is God. This laptop is God. This drink of soda water is God. You're God. I'm God. Everything is God. Everything is an expression of God. So this has many different forms. All these have very many different forms, but that's the basic idea, is that the universe we inhabit is not other than God. It is God's own self. And then, of course, there's deism. Deism is the notion that there's a God who's all powerful, that created the world and then just kind of left. So basically what this being did was kind of wind up the clock and then just let it tick and left the room. So God created but has nothing to do with us anymore, has no interest in us. Henotheism, which is something we're going to come back to, it's important because it's part of Israel's history, is this notion that there are plenty of gods out there and they're competing to see who's going to be the best. So that's from henos, which means one in Greek, and then theos, of course, God. But don't confuse this with monotheism. It's not. Mono is only God, only one God. Henotheism is one God who has defeated all the other gods. This is deep in Israel's tradition, where, especially in the older texts, they see Yahweh as the God of Israel who's fighting other gods. And then, of course, you have things like monolatrism, which is the notion that there is only one God, but this God manifests in many, many different forms. This is particularly associated with Hinduism, the notion of the avatar. So there's only one God, one transcendent being, but that being has expressed itself in Krishna, in Vishnu, in Shiva, so in Ganesh or Lakshmi. These are different gods that people worship only Lakshmi or only Ganesh, but they all are all worshiping the same God, just in different forms. Now, of course, as is well known, I think, Christianity is definitely a monotheistic tradition. All of the Abrahamic faiths are. And Christianity is part of a view of God that is really common. So all these gods that we've talked about, all these theisms and such, there are many different versions of them. This is an artificial taxonomy. These words are, ideas, guidelines, heuristic devices that help us to kind of make sense and categorize all these crazy religions that's out there. And I don't mean crazy. Well, I do mean crazy. Religions are crazy in a very real sense. I mean, Christianity is a crazy religion. It might be true, but it's still crazy. But these monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, these all have various versions throughout all the tradition. The tradition that we're going to get at is what's called classical theism. This is a Indo-European style of thought about the transcendent being. And it is shared, it's very ancient tradition. It's shared by different forms, not all forms, but different forms of Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, of course, Christianity. And for Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, this was the dominant form of understanding of God pretty much until the 17th century. So most of the history of the church. And it's still very popular today, but it's not, it doesn't enjoy the same sort of intellectual sway that it once did. But what's important about these, what's important about classical theism and its different iterations in all of these different religions is that there's one thing that is extremely important in understanding this being called God, and that is that God is utterly transcendent. But that's not just to say that God is just beyond. Rather, excuse me, sorry. I think we skipped a, nope. So I think I have a skip in the PowerPoint, but what's important to know is that as transcendent, God is the source of being itself. So one of the things that's very important about monotheism, and then particularly classical theism, which is monotheistic, is that that God is not a part of the universe or the universe itself. God is not a being in the universe. God is being itself and gives rise to the universe. God is the source of the universe. God is not equal to the universe like in pantheism. God doesn't inhabit the universe, but is part of it somehow, one of its constituent parts, another item among all the items out there. God is what gives rise to all of existence and being itself. And this is what Hart is getting at. So there's a lot of conceptions about God out there that are really just inaccurate when you're talking about particularly the Abrahamic faiths, Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions. And this is how Hart distinguishes between the little g God and the big G God. Because what's important to note is that when you're talking about God or a God, you haven't gotten to a person yet. You have only a category of being. So God is a word that indicates a certain kind of being in a similar manner that Homo sapien indicates a certain kind of being. It's a class of being. And so we need to understand what that means. Now, there are some common conceptions out there. There's the notion that God is the CEO of the universe. God is just the biggest, baddest guy around, and he can just toss planets across the universe and shoot lightning bolts out of his eyes and all of that. But he's still, God is still a part of the universe. God is the most metaphysically powerful being in the universe, but God is not the source of the universe. This is probably the most common in people today, that God is just the most powerful being. But the classical theism says, no, it's more than that. It's deeper than that. God is where being comes from. There's also the notion of the God of the demiurge. This was Plato's idea. This is that the universe and God coexist, and God sort of forms the universe out of this like blob of prime matter and gives it order from chaos. This is also deep in the Hebrew tradition and the ancient Near East and Semitic traditions generally. But this is the idea that God doesn't make the universe. God just gives it order. And is coexistent and co-eternal with the universe. And then you have the God of the mountain, the God who most of us do not believe anymore, but the God who's just the top dog. Zeus is usually one of the most famous examples with this. Again, the problem with all of these, here it is, here's the slide I was looking for. The problem with all of these is that, at least according to classical theism, which is the approach that we're going to take, given it's the dominant form of theological thought, and I think one of the most important for understanding Christianity, but the problem with all of these according to classical theism is that God does not dwell in the universe. Excuse me, I spoke wrong. It's not that God does not interact or dwell in the universe, but that's not an issue. Classical theism has God interacting with the universe in all kinds of ways and inhabiting the universe. Like we said in the last lecture, the notion of transcendence and immanence, that because God is so utterly beyond the world, God is also the most proximate thing to the world or the universe. Now the problem comes in when it says that God somehow was produced by the universe, or is just the universe, or is somehow just a part of the universe. This is a category error. So if God were an Olympian, or a CEO, or a demiurge, this would be very easy to prove indeed. Just how it can be proved that Zeus is not a god, at least in common mythological conceptions, because we went up to the top of Mount Olympus, and God wasn't there. And so this is not what classical theism means by the word God. This is often what people like Richard Dawkins and some of these new atheist critiques are making of God, and that's what got David Bentley Hart so riled up. But there's a real problem here in that when Christians are talking about God, and even further, when like the Abrahamic faiths are talking about God, this is not what they mean. They don't mean a being that's super powerful, but sort of dwells in the universe as one of its parts. Okay? God doesn't live somewhere. So, famously, when the Russian went around the world for the first time, and, oh man, I'm blanking on his name, but the first man to circle the entire Earth came back, and he said, well, there must not be a God because I didn't see him. Well, here's a problem with that. God is not in the universe chilling on some star somewhere way, way far away. God doesn't have a pad somewhere in the universe where he's out there, having a six-pack and watching the football game. No, God is wholly other than the universe. God cannot be disproven because you can't see God. God is not a material being. God is not the physical universe. God transcends it. And so this is what is meant by God. God is the transcendent source of everything, of all being. And thus is not like us in that God is not dependent being. So we talked about in the last lecture about dependent being, and the idea was we didn't cause ourselves. Nothing in this earth or this universe caused itself. It was caused by something else. This is the law of cause and effect. Now this can get a little tricky when you're talking about where the universe itself came from. And if you want to hear me talk about that, you can look at the lecture on Does God Exist? But God is different than every other being in the universe. God is not in the universe. God is not a part of the chain of cause and effect, because God is the source of being. And as the source of being, God is being itself. This is an attribute or essential characteristic of God that we commonly call aseity. And what we're about to talk about are the 5 absolute attributes of the divine being. And you're going to need to know these. You will need to know them very well, because I will assess you on them. So the first one is aseity. Aseity, it is kind of a goofy looking word, but it's from the Latin. It's just from the Latin a se, which means from itself. And so aseity is being from itself. It's self-sufficient being. It's uncaused being. It is being in the purest form. So God does not have a previous cause. God is just being and nothing else. Or I shouldn't say nothing else. Well, I guess what I want to say is God is being and needs nothing else to be God. So when somebody asks the question, I mean, I do remember when I was in junior high, I think, and some smart aleck kid looking at me and saying, "Yeah, but if God made everything, who made God?" You know, I've even heard Richard Dawkins say that to Stephen Colbert in an interview. The big problem with this question is it doesn't make a dang bit of sense. Okay, to ask who made God is about as helpful a question as asking how many miles of the gallon does your computer get? What time is the color red? How many miles are there in an hour? It's a category mistake. You cannot believe in God, but you can't say that classical theism is being logically inconsistent by saying no one made God if God is the source and fountain of being itself. It's like we kind of mentioned in one of the previous lectures. You can't ask what is the source of the source. That doesn't make any sense. That's not a sensible question. You can't do anything with it. And so if God is being itself, if God is the cause of everything, and God's self is uncaused as such, then no one made God. So God is being, and therefore God is. God is being itself. Now, if that's true, then we're going to take these a little bit out of order here. If that's true, then God doesn't have limits. If God is being itself, there's no partition to being itself. There are partitions in beings, little b beings, but God is capital B being, that thing we're all participating in. And so that means that God doesn't have limitations. God is infinite, properly speaking. From the Latin "in," which is privative, and "finis," which is end. God doesn't have borders. There is not a point where God ends and something else begins. God is the very basis of all things. And thus there's not, if God is from God's self and uncaused and infinite without any borders, then God doesn't have a before and after. This is what we mean by the concept of eternality. God doesn't have a moment when God wasn't. If being is the case, being will always have been the case. So the argument goes. So God doesn't change. Because if there's no before and after, there's nothing God is seeking to be. If God is being itself, God is perfection. God is the fullest actualization of God's self. And so God doesn't change. God doesn't have an experience where the divine being says, you know, I think I made a mistake. I'm going to change my mind. Or I just learned something. No, God is utterly in need of nothing because God is perfectly self-sufficient being and thus has everything God needs and so thus does not become. We become. We are beings that become. We are changing. We are moving towards something. Hopefully something better than we were before. That is not the case with God. God is the most fully actualized being in all of existence. And thus, that's what we mean by God being immutable. So again, the privative and then mutatio, which is where we get the word mutation. So God does not change. And therefore, if God doesn't have borders, if God is uncaused, if God is infinite and unchanging, then God is simple. Now, I know that sounds weird. You're going to think, what does that mean? God is a simpleton? Is God not very smart? Or does God have simple tastes? Is he into like minimalist art? No. It means that very specifically that God is not made of parts. Okay? We tend to think, and this is true in the physical world, the more complex a thing is, the greater it is. So a car is greater than a bicycle. And that's true to an extent, although the more complex a thing is, the more it's given to decay and deterioration. But in metaphysics, that's physics. That's something else. And I'm not a physicist, so I could be wrong about that. But I do know this. In metaphysics, the simpler the something is, the greater it is, because it's more pure and there were less steps required beforehand to cause it into being. Well, if God does not have a cause and is infinite in being itself, if God is the full plenitude of being, like a shoreless ocean, then there are no parts preceding God. Nothing came together to make God. God is not like Voltron or the Power Rangers or some sort of stew. Like, it's not something where you throw two parts infinity, one part eternality with a dash of aseity, and simmer that for a half an hour, let cool, and then you get God. No, God doesn't have any previous parts because God doesn't have a cause. God is the cause of causes, and thus is beyond the chain of cause and effect. There are no causes preceding God's. God is the cause of God, and thus God is God's own effect. Now that can seem a little confusing, but the basic logic is when you have a being that is responsible for everything else, you have a being that is responsible for being. And if God is being itself, then this is how classical theism says it must be understood. You can't chop being up into parts, and no parts can come together to make being. You can't say being began, and you can't say it's finite. It's the fullness of everything. So God is, according to classical theism, pure being. And this is what we call the absolute attributes. Absolute meaning they obtain to God and no one else. No being apart from God has these attributes. In fact, if any being had these attributes, they would just be God. So these are the things that make God God. This is what makes this divine being. However, that doesn't mean that God is wholly other than us to the extent that there is nothing that we share with God. We'll talk about this more when we get to the image of God. But there is something called the Transcendentals. Similar to the attributes, God is these things. Okay? Like God is infinite, is eternal, is immutable, God is being and truth and goodness and beauty. However, the difference is, while God is those things and the source of those things, unlike infinity, we and other created beings can participate in those characteristics. So there's no sense in which humans can ever participate in any real sense in eternity, because every human began to exist. And eternity is not just everlastingness. This is an important distinction. It doesn't just mean you will never end. Okay? Christianity and a bunch of other religions teach that the human soul is everlasting. But the difference between everlasting and eternal is the absence of time itself. There is no time for God. God is atemporal. And so we will never be that way. We will always be in time, partly because we always were caused and had a beginning to our being. However, we can participate in being as beings, lowercase b. We can participate in truth, unity, goodness. We can do good things. But we will never be goodness itself. Nothing can except the author of goodness. So you can't take all the good acts in the world, add them up, and somehow you've got goodness itself. No, these are acts that participate in goodness itself. And so the difference between the absolute attributes and the transcendentals, both are essential characteristics of God's essence, the very being of God. But absolute attributes are those that belong to God alone. The transcendentals are those which we can participate in too. And you'll notice that there are there's a word on both of these lists, and that is being. The Aseity is the special kind of being that God is, the infinite pure being from itself, but it's also something that we participate in as beings. And so to participate in being is good. According to this philosophy, being is better than non-being. Being exists, therefore being is true. Therefore being is unified, therefore it is good, and therefore it is beautiful. So, now, quick word. I know this was a longer lecture. I'll try to avoid that as much as possible. I don't like to go over 25 minutes. But this is a big topic, and I want to say a quick word about that too. You might be thinking to yourself, I don't know what the heck he just said. This is completely beyond me. I don't understand it. And that has nothing to do with your intelligence, okay? But this is not easy stuff, okay? I don't understand when people come to religion and are going to look at an idea like God and think that they're just going to get it. These things that I'm talking to you about took years of study and reflection for me to grasp, and I still am only just begun. So if you're feeling like, oh, this is too much, I can't get this, that's okay. If you weren't feeling that way, I think you either A, weren't taking the material seriously, or are some kind of special magic being that doesn't need this material to begin with. God is not an easy concept. Eternality, infinity, is not an easy concept. So if you're feeling a little bit nervous or totally lost, that's okay. Keep reviewing the material. Listen to the lecture again if you need to. Try to at least get the terms right. You know, at least know what aseity means. And we will keep coming back to these absolute attributes and transcendentals throughout the course. So we will have review as well. So keep with it. Remember, education is not a due. It's a privilege that you have to work for. And that means sometimes you got to read hard stuff and think about hard things. And that's a good thing. So keep it up. Don't lose heart. And I will see you next time, where we will talk about science and religion.